For many game series, talking about the hardest bosses is par for the course, but I rarely ever see it happen for Fire Emblem. And that makes sense. Bosses here are not really this big showdown at the end of a level. Many of them are merely a final ingredient in creating a hard chapter, which is definitely a topic that is debated more often. But I thought, why not apply this to Fire Emblem 2 for a change? Today we're gonna be going over every game and picking the hardest boss in each. While it simply is impossible to completely disconnect a boss from the circumstances of the chapter it's fought in, I am really gonna try to keep that in consideration. If a boss is only difficult because he's surrounded by a ton of other units, he won't be here. This is about the 1v1 at the end, mostly. We're also taking all difficulties into consideration. So situations where early bosses can sometimes be a nightmare on higher difficulties, like in Awakening or Shadow Dragon DS, are put to the test on lower difficulties as well, and then mostly lose out to other bosses, since those early ones are not difficult at all on lower settings. Alright, we start with Shadow Dragon, and today we are once again combining all the remakes and the originals together, because I think the answers are the same for both. So, like I literally just told you, that means the early game bosses from DS Shadow Dragon, who are among the worst things ever conceived, on say hard mode 4 or 5, won't win, since they're not hard at all on difficulties any sane player would use. Instead, I have to apologize because our first winner is an incredibly boring one. It's the final boss. Medeus is insanely difficult on hard mode 4 or 5, but also just generally really difficult to beat on even the lowest difficulties. And that's all the result of him only being able to be damaged by either Marth or your Manakits, Tiki, Bantu or Nagi. It creates a situation where how hard you find this boss depends entirely on how well you've trained these particular units, essentially punishing you for going in blind, and that's never a good thing. But what's arguably the most cruel factor here is that setting up a scenario where none of your units get killed right there in the final battle is not always possible. It all depends on how much you've used these guys and how much they can handle. Being the final boss and all, Medeus hits like a truck, so chances of any of your usable units being able to survive 2 hits from him is unlikely. And that means you have to ensure you either one around him, which again might be impossible, you constantly heal them, or you get your damage doer out of harm's way before it's Medeus' turn. Either solution is not ideal and comes with its own problems, but what I personally find the most unfair thing about Medeus is that if you got here unprepared and blind, you can't really save yourself unless you restart the entire game. If your Marth isn't strong and you haven't been using your Manakits, you're in a really tough position and you can't easily weasel your way out. We continue to the nearby continent of Valentia, where we're once again covering both Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia at once, and since the latter is quite clearly the definitive version, we'll mostly be talking about that. This game has a lot of very frustrating and terribly designed maps, and whether you could consider those layouts when talking about hard bosses is a bit up for debate here. Take for example Nui Baba's Abode. This map design completely sucks and makes for a real challenge. Nui Baba has a massive range to pick out your units, while you can do anything to get close to her in a convenient way. Her spell Medusa immediately drops any unit down to 1 HP, leaving them ripe for the picking for one of the many gargoyles the canters around her will summon or the bone knights nearby. Nui Baba's difficulty is so baked into the map that you can't really separate them, I think. Fighting her 1v1 on an open field wouldn't be challenging at all, but that's one of the pitfalls we have to circumvent here, and I can already tell you that for some games, that is basically impossible. However, while Nui Baba definitely relies on her fellow enemies, I think there's another boss from a terribly designed map that doesn't need any help. And that is Jeddah from the Swamps of Duma. Now, saying he doesn't need any help is a little fallacious, seeing as he constantly summons enemies as a canter himself. But I do think that it's different. Take out Jeddah and you have no enemies. If you remove Nui Baba, the canters and bone knights are still there. Jeddah's army of Moguls is part of his moveset, and part of what makes him easily the hardest boss in Valentia as well. Not only does he constantly summon these little eyeball monsters, he himself hits like a truck as well. He regenerates 10 HP every turn without having to pay HP to cast spells like most other spellcasters, holds a Draco shield, is located in the difficult to pass terrain of the swamp, and worst of all, can only be damaged every 4 rounds of combat. It's like he was made in a lab to be as frustrating as possible, and because of how his summoning mechanic works, you can't even retreat abuse to slowly whittle down his forces, since there are none. He just constantly resummons them. This entire map is basically built around fighting Jedha as a boss, so that it would be one of the hardest in the game, if not the series, isn't a huge surprise, but they didn't even have to make him this hard in order to be up there. Like, remove the regenerating health, and he's still in this video with more or less the same summary. We go from one of the easiest picks to one of the hardest next, with Mystery of the Emblem. I had to think about it long and hard, and even then I can't really think of a boss that stands out as particularly difficult in this game. I guess we could go with Medeus again, but I don't think he's really all that difficult here with the more cramped space, and it would also be kinda boring, of course. Not that I have a super exciting pick for you, because I decided to go with a technicality and pick Hardin from Soulful Bridge. He is a boss in this chapter, but he's not really the boss. That's George, or Jorge, however you're supposed to pronounce it. You can engage Hardin and then get your ass kicked, because he's more supposed to be like this threatening opponent that you have to run away from rather than challenge. In almost all other games in this video, I have tried to avoid picking bosses like this as the winner, but like I said, I think Mystery of the Emblem is so short on options that I'm going Hardin anyway. If you really feel that shouldn't be allowed, then I'd say that on harder difficulties, some of the unit bosses from the prologue can be incredibly difficult, like George for example. He can easily take out any of these starting units if you're not careful, but that's only on higher difficulties. On lower ones it isn't a factor. When we look at Genealogy of the Holy War, we also find the situation where, strictly speaking, Eldigan is probably the hardest boss, but just like Hardin, that is because you're not supposed to engage him. This time around we do have a sufficient alternative though, so that's our winner here, and he listens to the name Arion. He is the last boss of chapter 9, for whose sake, and while part of the challenge is that he's surrounded by a little squadron, I think he's strong enough to win this battle without them. His attack and defense are way up there, he has access to the legendary weapon Gungnir and its fitting bonuses, and he has the maximum number of leadership stars, meaning you'll be missing your target a whole lot. His skills include Nihil, which prevents critical hits and effective damage from bows, as well as Adapt and Pursuit, allowing him to attack multiple times in the same round. You're starting to get why this guy is so good yet. He's not completely unbeatable, he has no way to hit from range for example, but he doesn't really need that to be the hardest boss in Genealogy of the Holy War in my opinion. Next up is Thracia 776, which is a bit of a funny one, seeing as it's not a super well remembered game and probably the title the least of you watching have played, and yet the two options we have for this video are actually pretty well known nowadays. The first is arguably Thracia's most popular character in the modern era, Reinhardt. All four of his skills are really good: Vantage, Charge, Adapt and Pavise. He has 5 movement stars, which occasionally allows him an entire extra turn. Just like Arion, he also has 5 leadership stars, a really high follow-up critical multiplier, a Thracia exclusive thing that basically means he has an increased chance of hitting crits, and just really good stats to boot. And then I haven't even mentioned his 2 weapons: Dire Thunder, one of the strongest stones in the game, as well as a Meisteswerd, basically a silver sword. But would you believe it, this entire kit is still not enough for me to consider him the hardest boss in Thracia. He is the strongest boss, with the best setup, but he's a late game opponent, at which point your army should be capable and fine-tuned enough to take him. At the complete opposite end of your playthrough we have Gomez, a boss so notoriously difficult he has become infamous for it. He is the boss of chapter 8X, so quite early in the game, and especially if you haven't recruited Asbel from an earlier paralog, this guy might just end your run. His speed is so high he cannot be doubled at this point in the game. He can attack from range as well as close by, he's chilling on a throne, absorbing all bonuses that come from that, and his stats in general are closer to those you find at the end of the game rather than the start. He is a prime example of what we're looking for in this video. No difficult surroundings, other enemies or locations, just a purely really powerful boss that would be hard to defeat under any circumstances, provided it's still early in the game of course. And the funny thing is, the Binding Blade kinda has the exact same situation again. Henning is also the bandit boss of chapter 8X, so early in the game, and yet he's difficult as if he's a late game boss. He's a hero, so a promoted class, with stats that are way beyond what they should be, particularly his speed and skill. and that means you can't touch him. You can strike, you can shoot, he will dodge anything, and he will double you in return, with either a steel sword or hand axe. He doesn't even have a glaring weakness to magic either, like Gomez, so all you can do is just chip away and keep your weak units out of harm's way. The Binding Blade does have some other viable candidates, like Murdoch or Legans from the chapter right before Henning, but both of them fall below him for me personally. When it comes to Blazing Blade, I was more conflicted between several bosses. The first was Vaida, who ends up joining your army later, but is also the boss of chapter 24, Unfulfilled Heart. She's really strong, but also a bit of another Hardin, since you don't have to fight her, this is a survive map. I feel like challenging her here is more the intention than it was with Hardin and Eldigan, but it still feels a little like cheating to pick a boss you don't have to beat as the hardest, so I have also come up with alternatives in case you agree with that sentiment. Those are Cog of Destiny Lloyd and Uhai. The latter is the boss of the Dread Isle, and especially on the first playthrough, literally comes out of nowhere. The Dread Isle is a Fog of War map after all, and since Uhai is one of those rare bosses that moves, he can literally end one of your units before you even realize he was there. Once you actually know he's there, things don't necessarily get easier though. Most of his difficulty now comes from how hard it is to hit him, considering he's standing in the middle of a forest of forest tiles and also has more than decent skill and speed stats. He can hit from all ranges and in Hector mode even has a killing edge for more RNG shenanigans. However, since a decent chunk of Uhai's difficulty comes from the Fog of War, I think I'm gonna give the win to Lloyd, who is also a serious challenge but doesn't require the surroundings to help him out. Just like Uhai, Lloyd also moves, and while you could consider that a good thing, since it gets him off his throne, it also means he can wreck anyone you bring near him, and that is the more likely outcome. Using his light brand, he too can attack from range as well as close by, and he's also holding an iron rune, which prevents critical hits. Stat-wise, Lloyd is basically just a better Uhai. He too has very high skill and speed stats, but also boasts good strength and resistance numbers, so you have to be quite careful who you put up against him. Even your usually reliable units may end up not doing the job. Sacred Stones is usually considered one of the easier Fire Emblem games, and I think that also shows here. Compared to its fellow GBA brethren, I wouldn't say this game has a boss that can run with Denning or Lloyd. Carlisle is quite a bit of a difficulty spike when he's fought in chapter 14, and Walter has a huge asterisk next to his difficulty level due to his skill Pierce, now better known as Luna, not showing up correctly in the battle calculations, meaning that charging him might not pan out as the initial screen tells you it will, but both should be doable without too much frustration, even on your first try. My winner for this game is a boss I was kinda divided on whether it should count or not, which is the Death Goyle from the infamous Phantom ship. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be considered the boss of the map, but since it's not present at first and actually a reinforcement, it can be a little hard to tell. But yeah, this guy is the culmination of the hardest chapter in the game and fits that role perfectly. For only chapter 11, this monster is really souped up and just like Uhai earlier appears out of nowhere in the Fog of War, immediately moving for units unprovoked. It also has the ability to attack from range with its short spear, which is a really deadly option on an enemy that flies. You don't have too much space to get your frail units to safety here after all. And yes, that does mean I am keeping the restraints and environment of the map in mind a little here, but like I said, you can't separate that for every game, it's more of a tiebreaker in case of a tie. And in Magvel, this random Death Goyle has no equal. We continue to Tellius for Path of Radiance, and this game has two very clear outliers that are difficult for the exact same reason. As each other, but also as Medeus, because, as you undoubtedly remember if you ever played these games, both the Black Knight and Ashnard severely limit your options. The fight with the Black Knight is one I'm sure you're aware of. It's Ike 1v1 against the Black Knight with Mist alongside him for support. But the thing is, even a very strong Ike will have a tough time against the Black Knight if you didn't prepare him beforehand. In the background, a hidden timer for 5 turns only adds more pressure to this battle, and yet, I don't think this one should win. And the reason for that is because if you fail to kill him, you can just flee and continue the story. Defeating the Black Knight is optional, it's not required, and it brings him in the same camp as Eldigan and Vaida for me. And it's not like he's without competition, because Ashnard saw this look kinda cool and thought, I can do that. Only Ike, Gifka, T-Barn, Naisala, Nasir and Aina can damage him. The rest is only there for the vibes. And since you cannot have both Nasir and Aina in one playthrough, and you have to choose between the other three, the numbers are even lower than they seem. Now, Ike is a character you're very likely to have used and leveled, more so than Marth I think, but the others are brand new. Those would not be the guys I'd gravitate towards using here personally, if it wasn't mandatory. On lower difficulties, a strong Ike is probably enough to carry you through this battle, and on higher difficulties, you'll just have to do it, since the help doesn't come until the second phase. He will also now move towards you, which is almost unheard of for a final boss, and based on that status, I don't think I have to tell you that his stats, skills and weapon are top notch. That's to be expected. If you had to defeat the Black Knight, I would have picked him as the winner, but since you don't, my vote definitely goes to Ashnard, no doubt about it. Path of Radiance may have loved this mechanic, Radiant Dawn doesn't really do it. Ashura can only be defeated by Ragnell, which the game doesn't explicitly tell you, but the rest of your units can still hit her, so that's not really the same, and while she is definitely a strong boss, I think that for the spirit of this video I want to go with another winner. And that is Izuka. He's in some ways a sort of mini Jedha. He too is a summoner, meaning I consider his reinforcements to be part of his moveset. And this dude too just doesn't stop bringing in Legoose, we're talking 4 per turn. And unlike Jedha, when you finally get close and plan to smack him, he will warp away like the coward he is, forcing you to give chase while he summons more Legoose again. It's incredibly frustrating, much more so than Ashura, who is easily more powerful and strong though. But I personally would not consider beating her to be harder than Izuka. We move on to Awakening next, and this was also a very difficult one in my opinion. Awakening isn't necessarily an easy game, and it has plenty of chapters I would consider pretty difficult, but most of Awakening's challenge comes from the sheer number of opponents and reinforcements. The individual bosses, they aren't really difficult at all. So I was kinda conflicted. Am I gonna choose a boss who's really not that hard in the grand scheme of things, but is fair game? Or am I gonna bend the rules a little? I couldn't decide, so I'll just tell you both. The actual strongest boss in the game is without a doubt Apotheosis Anna. She is designed to be an absolute monster, and an absolute monster she is. Her stats are unlike anything we've ever seen before or since. She is stuffed with the best skills the game has to offer, including Rightful God, which is Grima's Lunatic Mode exclusive skill, and Vantage Plus, meaning she can always attack first. It makes full sense that she is the hardest boss in the game, if not the series, she was literally designed to be. So all I can say is, congrats IS, you did it. But of course, I can also see that picking her feels a little cheap. So if we look purely at the base game, I would say it's probably Gangrel who wins out. For only chapter 11, he has a pretty decent kit, with 11 sword, pretty high skill and speed, and he even starts to move as soon as you get into range of one of his lackeys. On harder difficulties, he also has the skill Lucky 7, which boosts his accuracy and dodging capabilities for the first 7 turns. That said, if you consider Gangrel the winner of Awakening, then I would say he is the weakest boss we're picking in this video, which is ironic, since Anna is probably the hardest. Next in line is Fates, and while we are gonna separate the 3 versions of this game, seeing as they have completely different bosses, I do think none of them are super interesting to talk about, so I don't want to waste too many words on the 3 of them either. For Birthright, I'm sorry, but I have to go for Garon in the Opera House. He is another boss you're definitely not meant to fight, you're meant to run away, but since he is literally the only boss that somewhat resembles a challenge in this game, I'm gonna go for him anyway. And keep in mind that includes Xander, who can only be defeated by Corrin, which is usually an easy way to get yourself on this list. However, I'd wager most Birthright Corrins can probably take Xander. I've at least never had a run of this game where this battle was challenging. The Conquest equivalent, Ryoma, named after the chapter where you 2 1v1 him, is definitely harder, no doubt about it, and I would actually consider it a candidate too, if Takumi wasn't such an incredibly difficult final boss. I was a little conflicted on whether I should count him, because the difficulty here is really another bit of both situation between Takumi, the layout and the waves of faceless he throws at you, but I think his tendency to fire from range and the ridiculous combination of skills he boasts is enough to land him this spot. Bold Stance essentially gives him access to Awakening's version of Power Up, We all know how strong that is, and on higher difficulties he also has Vengeance, which can really mess you up near the end of his health bar, and Dragon Skin, reducing the damage you dish out. If I had made Fates one entry, then Takumi would have probably been that winner. Because yes, Revelation is another game where really no winner comes up. I think the boring but probably correct answer is Anankos. He has the usual ridiculous endgame setup that we all know by now, but restrictions like with Medeus and Ashnard are nowhere to be found, so I'm really only picking him for lack of a better option. For Free Houses, looking at the 4 final bosses was definitely my first instinct again, but some dropped out of the race quite quickly. Nemesis' chapter is a good challenge, but him as a boss is nothing special. Crimson Flower's Immaculate One is definitely not as strong as Silver Snow's version, so that one loses out as well, and I've never really found Hagamon Husk Edelgard to be such a difficult battle, so that won't win either. So is Silver Snow Immaculate One the hardest then? No. Because I think the hardest boss of Free Houses is actually battleable in every route. The Immovable, aka Lord of the Lake, aka Saint Indek, the boss of Linhardt and Leonie's Paralog. This chapter is essentially what I described all the way back in the intro, a 1v1 against the boss. It's not literally one, but the rest of the enemies are not that tricky, so it effectively is. It's also another Fog of War map, but unlike previously, I don't think this friendly turtle really benefits from it that much here. What he definitely does benefit from is his ridiculously high defense, 4 massive health bars, barriers, powerful magic, and a long list of skills that include further defense buffs, quick repos to balance out his low speed, and Miracle. Yeah, even if you think you finally got him, he might just survive anyway and come for the unit you just did that risky move with. Now, Silver Snow's Immaculate One also has Miracle, which is ridiculous on a final boss by the way, but I think that chapter and her boss fight is severely helped in difficulty by the presence of other enemies and the long war of attrition from before it. Lord of the Lake is more or less just Lord of the Lake, and it's still hard. And then finally we have Engage, another very tricky one. And not because there are no hard chapters, not at all, Engage has plenty, but never before has the difficulty of a chapter come from the full picture as much as here I think. Every difficult chapter is the result of teamwork between several factors, where the boss is only one cog in an entire system of challenges. I think the 2 that most deviate from this are Lady of the Plains, which is Lynn's Paralog, or 7 Bracelets, the final Xenologue chapter where we face off against Neil or Rafal. The latter is easily the more difficult map, and Rafal is decked out to say the least. While his stats are not as high as Sombron, that is most likely to balance it out that he is held by an onslaught of Fel characters, all of which are essentially bosses in and of themselves, and Rafal has no problem helping you get rid of him to only strengthen his own kit even more. But it's exactly this level of help that made me gravitate more towards Lynn, although she knows a thing or two about help as well. She has tents on tents filled with reinforcements, so she's far from a lone wolf. But for me, the key factor here was Astra Storm, Lynn's bow move with a ridiculous 10 spaces range, meaning she can mess up your strategy and go at your units before you're even close to challenging her. It makes her a constant threat throughout the battle, and while that also applies to Rafal and even Sombron of course, I think with Lynn it's a lot less expected, and because it comes much earlier in the game usually, it's a much higher difficulty spike. It's a close call, but my vote goes to Lynn. And those have been my picks, but what would be yours? Surely you have some stories of facing tough bosses over the years, right? Share it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.